October 1347. 12 trading ships limp into the Sicilian port of Messina, but their cargo isn't silk or spice, it's horror. Sailors, gaunt and feverish, are covered in black, egg-sized swellings that ooze blood and pus. Within a fortnight, a third of the city is dead. This isn't just a story about a plague. It's the story of how a single germ invented your world, your right to a decent wage, your weekends off, the very concept of public health. This is the moment our modern world was forged in fire and agony. Now, where did this silent, invisible assassin come from? Our villain, the Bacillus Yersinia pestis, had been living quietly for centuries in the marmots and gerbils of Central Asia, just chilling in rodent populations, a natural part of that ecosystem, completely unknown to the wider world. But history, as it often does, had other plans. The spark that ignited this global inferno came in 1346. Mongol horsemen, under Jani Beg laying siege to the Crimean city of Kaffa, found their army ravaged by a mysterious illness. In a grim, chilling stroke of military innovation, they began catapulting the plague-ridden bodies of their own dead soldiers over the city walls. History's first recorded biological attack. The defenders of Kaffa, trapped, suddenly found themselves showered with death. This act, however barbaric, was merely the catalyst. The real carriers were far smaller, far more insidious. Fleas, those tiny, bloodthirsty parasites that thrive on rat blood, gorged themselves on the infected corpses. When the siege broke and the Genoese merchants fled, these fleas jumped ship, quite literally. They abandoned their dying rodent hosts for new, warmer human targets, hitching a ride on Genoese merchant vessels hauling slaves and caviar west. And where there were fleas, there were rats, stowing away in grain barrels and shipholds. It was a perfectly orchestrated, albeit accidental, biological delivery system. By the time those galleys reached Messina in October 1347, the chain reaction was primed. All it took was one sneeze, one unsuspecting flea bite, and the Yersinia pestis bacterium slipped silently into European bloodstreams. From Sicily, the plague didn't just travel, it sprinted. It hit Marseille in January 1348, Paris by June, London by autumn, and swept up the Baltic by 1350. If you could map the deaths month by month, you'd watch a dark, unstoppable tide wash over the continent, consuming everything in its path. It was a relentless, merciless advance, and Europe was utterly unprepared. Now, what was it like to actually get the Black Death? Because understanding the symptoms isn't just about medical facts. It's about grasping the sheer, unimaginable terror that gripped people. This wasn't some slow, lingering illness. This was an express train to the grave, and it was brutal. Imagine waking up one morning, and your head feels like it's been clamped in a vice. A headache so fierce it's as if someone has pressed hot, searing coins directly to your temples. By lunchtime, you feel a strange tenderness in your armpit or groin. And then you look down, and there it is. A cyst, not just a little bump, but a grotesque, painful swelling, rapidly ballooning to the size of an avocado pit, maybe even an apple. The skin stretched taut over it, turning a shiny, sickly purple. These, my friends, were the infamous buboes, the very namesake of the bubonic plague. They were excruciatingly painful, hot to the touch, and often burst, oozing a foul-smelling pus. But that's just the beginning of your descent into hell. Your body starts to betray you in other ways. You vomit black bile, a sign of internal hemorrhaging. Dark, ugly bruises, often called God's tokens, begin to bloom across your belly and limbs. By sunset, your fingertips might start to blacken, the flesh dying as the infection spreads. Your pulse becomes so faint that the physician might mistakenly think you're already gone, until you cough, releasing a fine mist of bacteria directly into their terrified face. The Black Death wasn't monolithic. The most common was the bubonic form, characterized by those buboes. If untreated, which it almost always was, this form killed a staggering 60% of its victims. Then there was the pneumonic form. The bacteria infected the lungs, causing them to essentially liquefy. Victims coughed up frothy, blood-tinged sputum, spreading the disease through the air. This form was almost 100% fatal within a brutal 3 days. And finally, the most rapid and horrifying was the septicemic form. In these cases, the bacteria overwhelmed the bloodstream so quickly that victims would bleed from every orifice and die before the buboes even had a chance to form, often collapsing suddenly. Contemporary writers described it as the stroke of an arrow without sound. And if by some miracle you did survive, you were rarely left unscathed. Survivors were often disfigured, sometimes blind, and always profoundly traumatized. They had walked through hell, watched their world crumble, and carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Now, as the plague tore through bodies, it also tore through the very fabric of society. This wasn't just a medical crisis, it was a complete societal breakdown. Imagine a world where the most fundamental bonds, the very glue that holds communities together, simply dissolved under the weight of fear and death. Families fled one another. Husbands, terrified of contagion, abandoned their sick wives. Children were left to fend for themselves, or worse, left to die alone. The instinct for self-preservation, primal and overwhelming, shattered every social norm. In cities like Siena, healthy workers, gripped by paralyzing fear, refused to perform essential tasks. They wouldn't even enter the mint, for fear of touching coins that might carry the air of death. Priests refused last rites. Notaries refused to witness wills, leaving estates in chaos. Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through this horror, wrote of a world where brother forsook brother, uncle nephew, and even wives their husbands. It was a world turned upside down. The demographic impact was simply staggering. Entire villages, once vibrant and bustling, simply vanished from the tax rolls. Take Tilgardsley in East Anglia, a place that was just there, and then, poof, gone, wiped clean from the records. Fields lay fallow and overgrown because the oxen died, and the peasants were buried beneath them, or simply left unburied. Wolves padded boldly into English hamlets, drawn by the grim feast of the unburied. Imagine that scene. The wild moving into the spaces left empty by human demise. But amidst this devastation, a strange and unexpected shift began. With labor suddenly drastically scarce, we're talking about a third, sometimes even half of the workforce simply gone, the balance of power began to tilt. Surviving serfs, once tied to the land, suddenly found themselves with unprecedented leverage. Lords, facing ruin, offered unheard-of concessions: cash wages, free housing, and even permission for peasants to marry without buying a license. Serfdom, that ancient system of agricultural bondage, effectively crumbled in Western Europe by 1400. So, if you're out there enjoying your weekend off, you can actually thank the Black Death. By killing enough laborers, it forced lords to bargain, laying the groundwork for paid labor and, yes, even your precious 2-day break. It was a golden age for the common man, but it was built on a mountain of bodies. Now, when the world is ending around you and you have no scientific understanding of germs or viruses, what do? You turn to what you know, a bizarre, often terrifying blend of medical ineptitude and rampant superstition. And let me tell you, the medieval response to the Black Death is a testament to humanity's capacity for both desperate innovation and profound cruelty. Medieval doctors, bless their hearts, were trying their best with the knowledge they had. They believed the plague was caused by miasma, or foul air, a noxious vapor rising from decaying matter. This led to those creepy, bird-like masks with long beaks, stuffed with aromatic herbs, spices, and roses, meant to filter out the bad air. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Their treatments were equally creative. One popular method involved shaving chickens, yes, actual chickens, and then strapping the poor birds, still alive, to the patient's buboes, hoping the chicken would draw out the venom. When that failed, they resorted to lancing the buboes and smearing the wounds with bizarre concoctions, including pigeon blood. Physicians also advised sleeping upright, abstaining from sex, and above all, avoiding sad thoughts. Yes, easy peasy, right? Just keep cheerful when your street is a charnel house. But the desperation wasn't confined to pseudo-medical practices. It fueled a terrifying surge in religious fanaticism and scapegoating. The flagellants, for instance, roamed the roads, whipping themselves publicly and brutally until their backs were raw. They believed God's wrath had unleashed the plague, and by inflicting pain upon themselves, they could atone for sins and soothe God's anger. And then, of course, there was the scapegoating. When people are desperate for answers, for someone to blame, minorities often bear the brunt. In this case, it was often the Jewish communities. Whispers, then shouts, spread that Jews were poisoning wells. This monstrous lie led to unspeakable atrocities. In Strasbourg, on a single brutal February day in 1349, 2,000 Jewish people were rounded up and burned alive. The townsfolk, in their deranged fervor, swore the flames would cleanse the air. It's a chilling reminder of how fear can twist humanity into something truly monstrous. Amidst all this chaos, there was one glimmer of something resembling rational public health. The only real prophylaxis, the only thing that actually worked, was isolation. The shrewd merchants of Venice, ever practical, decreed that ships arriving from plague-stricken areas had to wait for 40 days, 40 giorni in Italian, anchored offshore. They had no idea why it worked, just that it seemed to slow the spread. And in doing so, they inadvertently coined a word that we still use today: quarantine. So what were the numbers? How many people actually died? Well, getting precise figures from the 14th century is a historian's nightmare. Medieval record-keeping was patchy at best. But after centuries of meticulous research, historians now largely agree on a truly horrifying estimate. Europe lost somewhere between 40 and 60% of its entire population. We're talking about roughly 25 million souls, maybe even more, wiped out in a brutal, relentless onslaught that lasted for about 6 years. That's not just a statistic, that's half a continent gone. The scale of this demographic catastrophe is mind-boggling. Florence, a great cultural and economic center, shrank from a bustling city of about 100,000 people down to a mere 50,000. Paris reportedly buried 50,000 people in a single brutal summer. The sheer volume of bodies overwhelmed every system, leading to mass graves and desperate, hurried burials. And the death toll wasn't evenly distributed. In tiny, isolated Iceland, the death toll reached an astonishing 60%. Yet, in parts of Poland, the mortality rate was significantly lower, sometimes as little as 15%. Why the variation? Sparse population density certainly helped. The fewer people crammed together, the slower the spread. And crucially, swift, decisive quarantines proved effective where they were implemented rigorously. Areas that were more isolated, less connected to the major trade routes also fared better. What's even more chilling is that the villain of our story, Yersinia Pestis, hasn't actually gone anywhere. Modern science has allowed us to peer directly into the past. DNA studies on remains from London's East Smithfield plague pits confirm the same bacterium still exists today. It's still out there lurking in rodent populations. The difference, thankfully, is that it no longer holds the ferocious ecological niche it commanded in the 14th century. We have antibiotics now, we understand transmission, we have public health measures, but imagine just for a moment what it must have been like. If a pathogen like COVID-19, with all our modern medicine, scared you, and it absolutely should have, now try to imagine something literally 10 times deadlier. Something that arrived when nobody knew what a germ was. They had no concept of bacteria, no idea how disease spread, no antibiotics, no vaccines, no understanding of hygiene, just pure, unadulterated terror. Now for those who somehow miraculously made it through, the ordeal didn't just end when the fever broke. The psychological aftermath of the Black Death was as profound and enduring as the physical devastation. Survivors, often referring to themselves as the recovered ones, carried an immense burden. Imagine living in a world where half the people you knew, loved, and interacted with were simply gone. Survivor's guilt, a concept we understand deeply today, was rampant, a heavy shadow cast over every waking moment. Why me? Why did I live when my family, my friends, perished? This profound trauma seeped into every aspect of culture. Art, once vibrant, turned morbid, dark, and utterly obsessed with death. Frescoes depicted macabre scenes, skeletons grinning, dancing in chain-linked processions, leading emperors and peasants alike to the grave. It was a stark reminder of death's ultimate equalizer. Tombs carried chilling existential inscriptions: "I was as you are, you will be as I am." A grim, inescapable truth for a generation that had stared death directly in the face. Literature too bloomed, but with a dark, cynical edge. Think of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written just decades after the plague. His character, the Pardoner, a corrupt ecclesiastical figure who sells fake relics, perfectly captures the disillusionment of a generation that no longer trusted holy authority. When prayers failed, when God seemed to have abandoned humanity, faith fractured, and satire became a coping mechanism. Even the children born in the generations immediately following the plague were often given morbid, evocative names that reflected the pervasive grief and lingering fear. Names like Languish or Apollina. But here's the truly fascinating, almost paradoxical twist. This same profound trauma also cracked open something immense, a surge of creativity, innovation, and opportunity. It's almost counterintuitive, right? But think about it. The diminished population meant a sudden, dramatic abundance of resources. Land, once scarce, became cheap. Food, once a constant struggle, was suddenly more available. So survivors, particularly the common people, ate better, and studies suggest they even grew taller and healthier. Crucially, the weakening of feudal ties meant that many were freed from the oppressive bonds of the land. They had more disposable income, more freedom, and a new perspective on life's fragility. This newfound mobility and wealth wasn't just squandered. It was poured into new ventures, into art, fueling the early Renaissance, into universities, which would eventually be revitalized, and into risky, ambitious sea voyages. Consider this. Christopher Columbus's grandfather was a plague orphan, born into a world shattered by death, but also a world brimming with new, unforeseen opportunities. It's a powerful testament to human resilience, to finding light in the darkest of shadows. If the Black Death was a medical catastrophe, it was also an economic earthquake that utterly demolished the medieval system. To truly grasp this, you have to understand the bedrock of medieval society: feudalism. Feudalism, at its core, relied on an enormous surplus of cheap, exploitable labor. The vast majority of the population were peasants, tied to the land, working for their lords. It was a system built on abundance of hands and scarcity of everything else. But what happens when you suddenly halve that workforce? What happens when 30, 40, 50% of your laborers are simply gone? The balance of power, my friends, doesn't just shift, it flips entirely. Lords, who had once held absolute sway over their serfs, suddenly found themselves in a desperate scramble. Their fields, their very source of wealth and power, lay fallow. Their crops, if planted, couldn't be harvested. They faced ruin. In this moment of crisis, the surviving peasants, those recovered ones, found themselves with unprecedented leverage. Lords who just months before wouldn't have given them the time of day were now practically begging them to work. They offered unheard-of concessions: cash wages, a radical departure from the old system, free housing, and even permission for peasants to marry without having to buy a license. Serfdom, that ancient system of agricultural bondage, effectively crumbled and ended in Western Europe by 1400. It wasn't abolished by grand decree, it simply withered away under the sheer weight of demographic change. This labor shortage also opened doors for other groups. Women, who had largely been confined to domestic roles, now found new opportunities in urban trades. They stepped into roles as brewers, weavers, and even blacksmiths. The guilds, those powerful medieval trade associations, once exclusive and expensive, were suddenly desperate for members. They dropped their prohibitive entry fees, further democratizing access to skilled labor. The economic ripple effects were profound. With fewer people to feed and vast tracts of land lying vacant, the prices of everyday goods collapsed. Grain, the staple of the medieval diet, fell by as much as 30%. Meanwhile, wages for the surviving laborers skyrocketed, increasing by up to 50%. Think about that, your income going up by half, while your cost of living goes down by a third. For the first time in centuries, commoners could afford luxuries. They could buy meat not just on feast days but on weekdays. It was a dramatic redistribution of wealth, not through revolution, but through demographic catastrophe. And the capital that was once tied up in the old feudal system, or spent on grand crusades, now found new avenues for investment. It began to finance practical innovations, water mills to process grain more efficiently, and crucially, early printing presses. These were investments that would fundamentally reshape society and intellectual life. Historians often call it the golden age of the common man, and while it brought unprecedented opportunities, we must never forget the grim truth. This golden age sprouted directly from a graveyard. Now, in a world where disease was understood as divine punishment, what happens when your most fervent prayers, your most desperate pleas to God, utterly fail? What happens when the very institutions you rely on for spiritual solace seem helpless, or worse, are themselves consumed by the plague? Well, what happens is that faith, that bedrock of medieval life, doesn't just waver, it fractures. The Catholic Church, the dominant spiritual and political power in medieval Europe, was hit hard, both physically and spiritually. Its revenues collapsed, not just because parishioners were dying, but because those who survived often stayed home, terrified of contagion. And a staggering proportion of the clergy, estimates suggest a third, sometimes even more, also succumbed to the plague. Think of the impact. Entire parishes without a priest, monasteries, once bustling centers of devotion, now echoed with empty cloisters. The spiritual infrastructure of Europe was decimated. Adding to this crisis of faith was the political situation of the papacy itself. At this time, the Pope wasn't even in Rome. He was exiled in Avignon, France. To many, this already made the Church seem weak. When the plague struck, and the Pope in Avignon seemed utterly powerless to stop it, the institution looked not just vulnerable, but truly impotent. How could God's chosen representative on earth not protect his flock? This vacuum, this profound disillusionment, created fertile ground for dissent and new ways of thinking about faith. Reformers, bold thinkers like the English theologian John Wycliffe, began to articulate radical ideas. Wycliffe argued that if priests and the elaborate rituals of the Church couldn't protect their flocks, then perhaps the ultimate authority shouldn't reside with Rome, but with the Bible itself. He advocated for translating the Bible into the vernacular. His followers, the Lollards, were essentially anticipating the Protestant Reformation by a full 60 years. But it wasn't just about institutional reform. Across Europe, mystical movements sprang up, reflecting a desperate yearning for a more direct, personal connection with the divine. Figures like the German theologian Meister Eckhart preached that a direct, unmediated experience of God mattered far more than external sacraments or the intercession of priests. This was a profound shift, moving away from rigid hierarchy towards individual spirituality. In short, my friends, the Black Death didn't just kill people. It didn't just dismantle economic systems. It killed medieval certainty. It shattered the old worldview, the comforting belief in a divinely ordered universe where the Church had all the answers. It forced people to question everything, to look for new explanations, new paths to salvation, and new ways to understand their place in a world that had suddenly become terrifyingly unpredictable. Now, amidst all this death and despair, this chaos and superstition, something truly remarkable began to emerge. It was a slow, hesitant flicker of light, but it would eventually ignite one of humanity's greatest achievements, the dawn of scientific observation. Because, as the saying goes, necessity truly is the mother of invention, and in the face of an incomprehensible killer, sheer necessity birthed a new way of thinking. Before the Black Death, medical understanding was largely theoretical, based on ancient texts and philosophical reasoning, not on direct observation. But when people were dying by the thousands, when every old remedy and prayer failed, desperate measures led to practical insights. The Venetian doctors, those same pragmatic souls who invented quarantine, started doing something revolutionary. They began to systematically record data. They noted where outbreaks began, how many days they lasted, and crucially, which rudimentary interventions seemed to slow the spread. These simple tables, These meticulous observations were the very earliest embryonic forms of what we now call modern epidemiology. They weren't just guessing anymore, they were collecting empirical evidence. And it wasn't just doctors. Consider surgeons. Before the plague, surgery was a low-status profession, often performed by barbers. But the plague forced them to confront the disease directly. They began to actually open cadavers, to perform autopsies, something largely forbidden before. They meticulously compared the grotesque buboes they saw on the surface to the swollen lymph nodes within the body. This direct, hands-on examination of the human anatomy, driven by the desperate need to understand the disease, began to lend surgeons a new level of respect and credibility. It was the first step towards separating surgery from mere barbering and elevating it into a legitimate medical science. This new empirical approach also led to the creation of permanent public health infrastructure. Cities ravaged by repeated outbreaks realized they couldn't just rely on prayers and pigeon blood. They needed systemic responses. Public health boards, once temporary crisis committees, became permanent municipal offices. These boards began setting precedents for things we now take for granted: the establishment of dedicated quarantine stations, rudimentary hospital hygiene, and regulations for burying the dead. They were laying the groundwork for the idea that governments had a responsibility to protect the health of their citizens, a radical concept in the medieval world. In essence, the plague proved, brutally and unequivocally, that empirical data, direct observation, and practical measures could, in fact, tame superstition. It showed that understanding how things worked, even without knowing why in a microbial sense, was more effective than any prayer or mystical cure. This intellectual habit, this reliance on observation and data, was an absolute game changer. It was the intellectual spark that centuries later would blossom into the scientific revolution, giving us everything from the microscope to understand the invisible world of germs to the vaccines that protect us from them today. The Black Death, in its horrifying way, was a brutal, involuntary lesson in the power of science. So after all this devastation, all this societal upheaval and quiet revolution, what was the lasting legacy? Well, the demographic hole left by the Black Death was so immense, so profound, that it took a staggering 2 centuries for Europe's population to finally refill to its pre-plague levels. Think about that, 200 years. Imagine the ghost towns, the empty fields, the generations born into a world forever shaped by absence. But by the time Europe's population finally recovered, the continent had changed beyond recognition. The old medieval world was gone, replaced by something new, something vibrant, something that was, in many ways, fundamentally modern. We saw the rise of stronger parliaments as monarchs, desperate for funds and support in a depopulated landscape, had to negotiate more with representative bodies. Conversely, the power of the old, landed nobility, whose wealth was tied to their estates and their serfs, waned significantly. Their economic base had been shattered, and they never fully recovered their former dominance. Universities, which had struggled during the immediate aftermath, were re-energized. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, just a century after the plague, sent a flood of Greek texts and scholars fleeing west into Europe. These ancient texts, rediscovered and re-examined by a generation hungry for new knowledge, fueled the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance, and there was a profound maritime impulse, a powerful drive to find new trade routes. Why? Because the old overland routes, the very arteries that had once carried wealth and goods, had also terrifyingly carried death. There was a desire to bypass those plague-ridden paths, to find new horizons, new sources of wealth, and perhaps new lands untouched by such ancient scourges. This, my friends, was the genesis of the age of exploration. And let's not forget the technological revolution. When the first printing press, that clattering marvel of engineering, began operation in Mainz around 1450, the conditions for its success were, ironically, perfect and directly shaped by the plague. The workforce was smaller, meaning higher wages for skilled craftsmen. Investors, with new capital freed from old feudal structures, were hungry for profitable ventures. And there was a massive demand for books, for knowledge, for new ideas in a world that had been forced to question everything. These were precisely the conditions that helped Johannes Gutenberg's debt-ridden workshop succeed, leading to a revolution in information dissemination that would change the world forever. So here's the astonishing truth. The plague that closed medieval Europe, that brought unimaginable suffering and death, also, quite accidentally, opened the door to the Renaissance and, ultimately, the modern age. It was a brutal, involuntary reset button, clearing the way for new social structures, economic systems, scientific thought, and artistic expression. It's a testament to the fact that even from the deepest darkness, profound change can emerge. If this story changed how you see the present, subscribe for more like it. In the comments, tell me, which medieval cure would you absolutely refuse? Share this with a friend who thinks history is boring, and let's change their mind. Thanks for watching. So when all is said and done, what's the ultimate takeaway from the Black Death? It was, unequivocally, Europe's darkest hour. A period of unimaginable suffering, loss, and chaos that tested the very limits of human endurance. But, and this is the crucial part, it was also the crucible, the intense fiery furnace, that forged much of what we now simply call modern life. Think about it. The concept of fair wages, the foundational principles of scientific observation and epidemiology, even the very idea that governments owe their citizens a basic level of protection from disease. These weren't just abstract ideas that magically appeared. They were born, painstakingly, brutally, out of the ashes of the Black Death. In 1347, the Yersinia pestis bacterium, our microscopic villain, won every single battle. It ravaged bodies, it decimated populations, it brought entire societies to their knees. But humanity, though bruised, battered, and literally halved in number, did something extraordinary. It didn't just survive, it reimagined society. It innovated, adapted, and ultimately, it came back stronger, more resilient, and fundamentally transformed. So the next time you find yourself facing a crisis, large or small, that feels utterly overwhelming, that feels world-ending, I want you to remember this story. Remember the Black Death. Remember that we, as a species, have been through worse. We have faced down invisible enemies that wiped out half our numbers, shattered our world, and left us in utter darkness. And yet, we rebuilt, we innovated, we found new ways forward, and in doing so, we forged the future. That's the enduring, powerful lesson of immortal history.